Good morning or good afternoon, depending from which time zone you are joining us. It's a big pleasure to welcome you to this special webinar on gender, religion, and forced migration, global dynamic and lived experiences. I'm Jocelyne Cesari. I am a senior fellow at the Berkley Center and part of a new research initiative on religion and the crisis of displaced persons that has started now for more than a year, in which we are trying to address the religious dimension of the refugee crisis in all its aspects, displacement, political disturbances, social integration, and look at both the local context and the global context. So in this perspective, or from this perspective, the gender aspect of the religious aspect of migration is apparently obvious, but much less systematically surveyed or studied. And it can be looked at both ways, meaning how do people from a certain gender experience the displacement, and how is religion part of this experience, for the good or the bad, either. And also how the gendered aspect of the refugee crisis is taken into account in the policies, both international or national. So to address this question, it's really a pleasure to introduce the two panelists. First, Elena Fiddian-Qasmiyeh, who is Professor of Migration and Refugee Studies at University College London, and the main investigator of the project called Refugees Host. And then Sandra Iman Pertek, who is postdoctoral fellow at the University of Birmingham, and the principal investigator of the project called Protecting Forcibly Displaced Women and Girls in the Muslim World. So I'm going to give each of you 15 minutes to make your argument. Then I'm going to engage with you in a discussion, and then we open to Q&A. I want to say to the audience that Q&A is written. You will rewrite your questions. And also, just to be clear with everybody, this session is recorded. And for the one who have registered, they will get access to the recording, I think, in a few days. So, Elena, the floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, Jocelyne. Thank you to all of you for organising this event, and to those of you for being here today. I'm going to be adding a few links in the chat as I go along, just to provide access to some of the resources that I'll be drawing on, and some broader references that might be of relevance to yourselves and for your future research as well. So just in terms of my own background, I've been conducting research on the intersections between gender, religion, and displacement since the mid-2000s. Between 2005 and 2010, I conducted research in Algeria, Syria, South Africa, Cuba, and Spain, which led to my book, The Ideal Refugees, Gender, Islam, and the Sahrawi Politics of Survival, which examines the ways in which Sahrawi refugees in the protracted displacement situation in southwest Algeria engage in the politics of gender and the politics of Islam in the context of the humanitarian arena, which very much prioritizes secular discourses and secular practices in spite of the religious backgrounds and identities of displaced populations themselves. And that book examines the ways in which refugees and their refugee leaders represent their own displacement situations in ways that resonate with a particular prioritization of female empowerment and of secularization, effectively. In 2011, I convened a conference and subsequently edited an issue of the Journal of Refugee Studies looking at faith-based humanitarian responses to displacement, which included a wide range of articles engaging in the relationship between displacement and responses to displacement and religion, but also several pieces looking specifically at gender within that context. Subsequent to that, I'll be drawing on this research a little bit shortly, published by the Henry Luce Foundation, looking specifically at that intersection between gender, religion, and refugees, which also led to a summary blog on the Berkley Forum. And then, as Jocelyne has just indicated, I've also been leading the Refugee Hosts research project, examining the roles of local faith communities, amongst other local communities, in responding to the displacement of people from Syria in the context of Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. So that's the main foundation for the research that I'll be drawing on. Here are a couple of additional resources that might be of relevance, including my presentation at the UN High Commissioner's Dialogue, in which I discuss intersectionality, which I'll move on to in a moment. A British Council-funded project looking at religion and social justice for refugees in Cameroon, Greece, Jordan, Lebanon, Malaysia, and Mexico, with colleagues from across the UK and from Yale. And a more recent study commissioned by the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs on evidence relating to refugees from Syria in the context of Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. Now, I'm going to touch on some areas in an attempt not to overlap too much with Sandra. So I'm going to start with some general background on some of the assumptions that exist relating to gender and faith-based responses to displacement, because I think this is an important element of understanding the ways that different political and policy actors, including NGOs, relate to refugees. And then I'll move on to some more questions relating to intersectional approaches to displacement, with a particular focus on men and boys, because I know that Sandra will be discussing the situation of women and girls in particular afterwards. So one very important assumption that exists within discourses around displacement and relating to responses to displacement is that there's a particular interest in the roles played by faith-based organizations and by local faith communities in providing assistance and protection to refugees and asylum seekers. And this is part of what's called the localization of aid agenda, which seeks to prioritize the responses by locally based actors themselves. And yet this interest in faith-based organizations is also often accompanied by concerns about the nature and the impacts of faith-based and local community responses to displacement, which often stem from largely negative assumptions around the relationship between religion and gender. There's often the assumption that faith-based organizations and local communities are more, quote, conservative and, quote, patriarchal than secular organizations and agencies. There's also often the assumption that local faith communities and local faith leaders will hinder the participation of women and girls as decision makers, as aid and service providers, and as beneficiaries alike. And there's also the assumption that faith-based organizations will refuse to engage with individuals and social groups that do not comply with dominant norms relating to gender and sexuality. And indeed, it's clear that religion is often used to legitimize patriarchal hierarchies, as my colleagues and I discuss in the MIU policy brief, which is at the top of the references that I've shared with you already. And yet secular worldviews and secular organizations also have their own forms of, I quote, gender trouble, which is the term used by Judith Butler. And this gender trouble within secular organizations is precisely why secular organizations and international organizations have been constantly encouraged to more meaningfully engage in gender sensitive planning, programming, and implementation through the gender and development agenda. So in fact, if we look at the evidence, neither faith-based organizations nor secular organizations are automatically, quote, conservative or, quote, progressive with regards to gender roles or relations. And both secular organizations and religious organizations can carry gender limiting beliefs and practices. So a survey of attitudes towards LGBTI asylum seekers conducted by the NGO ORAM, Organisation for Refugees, Asylum and Migration, they concluded that FBO's views on providing services to LGBTQI people was no better or worse than attitudes held by secular institutions. Nonetheless, discussing LGBTQI rights and visibility can at times raise barriers to cooperation and dialogue between different groups of secular and faith-based actors, and a sensitive approach is therefore required to promote dialogue and create spaces for the free expression of different perspectives. But it's important to look at the specific context rather than assuming that faith-based organizations will necessarily be more limited in their approaches and their practices in supporting the needs and rights of different groups of displaced people. And we can see, for example, that a study of female internally displaced Kikuyu victims of sexual and gender-based violence in Kenya, that study highlights that local faith communities were the only actors actually able to provide trauma counselling in that context. So that was a study by Pertek in the special issue of the Journal of Refugee Studies I referred to earlier. So what we really need to look at is the specific context and to disrupt those key assumptions rather than perpetuate them. And that's partly what the Refugee Host Project has been looking at through research with 9 local communities in Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey, including the roles played by refugees who are themselves faith leaders. And I'll just post in the chat box another reference to an article that my colleague Estela Carpi and I published looking at Syrian faith leaders' responses to displacement in the context of North Lebanon. So having started with that very brief introduction, I want to just highlight the importance of an intersectionalist approach. And here, by intersectionality, I recognize the origins of this concept and this framework within the context of African-American feminist struggles. And here we can understand intersectionality is referring to the recognition that experiences of displacement are framed by a range of intersecting and overlapping identity markers, including gender, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and age, but also by a range of intersecting and overlapping power structures, such as patriarchy, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and homophobia. And if we identify that intersectionalist lens as our starting point, we can also see that the relative significance of these identity markers and related power structures shift across time and space, including in processes of displacement. And that can help us understand, or perhaps even predict, that individuals and social groups may be vulnerable to or at risk of different forms of violence throughout different stages of their journey to secure international protection. It also helps us move away from an essentialist understanding of vulnerability to instead look at a situational approach to vulnerability. And I'll end my presentation focusing a little bit more on that distinction between a situational versus an essentialist perspective. But that relative significance of identity markers and of related power structures also disrupts understandings that sometimes arise when we think about minority and majority religious groups. So somebody can be a member of a majority religious community in their country of origin and have the privileges that might arise from that majority membership. But as they move to a host community, and perhaps in a neighboring country first and subsequently in a second country of asylum, they might find themselves either being or being identified as being a member of the minority or the minority community in that group. And the minoritization of people's identities intersect in complex ways with gender, including in contexts where religion is read through gendered lenses, depending on who is visible as the member of a religious majority or minority, according to clothing, different markers of identity which are visible or which are read through the skin, as it were, to draw on Sara Ahmed. So here I'm going to just divert attention a little bit from what which is the particular needs and rights of women and girls. And I'm going to just flag that there are many reasons, of course, why we need to highlight the specific experiences and needs of particular groups on an operational level, and that we still need to redress refugee women's and girls' earlier invisibility in mainstream studies and policies and practices, precisely by purposefully tracing the specific and diverse experiences of women, children, LGBTQI, refugees, older people, and people with disabilities, amongst others. And yet, this focus on particular categories of people is also problematic and dangerous in different ways. So here I'm just going to suggest that there's a major danger of presenting in advocacy and campaigning and in policies alike, of presenting certain groups as having specific needs because I would argue that it fuels popular and populist narratives that the groups which aren't listed as having particular specific needs are not vulnerable and are therefore less worthy of attention and of assistance and protection. And by extrapolation, that the people who aren't identified as having those specific needs aren't bona fide refugees. Now, this institutional framing can become part of a system that enables. And in this context, it's not surprising to see discrimination and violence against refugee men, in particular, when the international system consistently reasserts that women, children, and disabled people, inter alia, are vulnerable and particularly worthy of protection, while men's gender-specific vulnerabilities have actually also been systematically rendered invisible throughout these processes. So what I would suggest is that there is a need for gender-sensitive assessments of the particular needs of men and boys with different religious, ethnic, and other social identities. And this is particularly important given the extent to which refugee men from the Middle East and from sub-Saharan Africa have been depicted in the media and in political rhetoric as sexual predators and terrorists by virtue of their intersecting gender religious identities. So importantly, refugees' religious and ethnic identities may be imposed by external observers rather than being markers of personal identity and actual identification. And indeed, refugees from the Middle East, for example, are often assumed to be Arab and Muslim, rather than recognizing the ethnic and religious heterogeneity of refugees from and in the region. And we've seen this in the case of Syrian Christians who were part of the minority community in Syria, and who traveled or were resettled to the United States and imagined that Christian communities in the United States, but they were read as Muslim because of the way that they were perceived and interpolated by other people, and actually faced discrimination as a result. So I'm also going to suggest not dismissing the significance of sexual violence, but in the focus on SGBV, that it's also important to complement a focus on violence with a focus on gender-based violence as well. And there's a shift in a lot of humanitarian discourse towards this recognition of gender-based violence in conjunction with sexual violence as well. And to flag the protection needs that arise from different forms of gender-based violence towards men, which have included sex-specific genocide and the sex-selective massacres of specific men that we've witnessed in the former Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, in Syria, and in Iraq, amongst specific men with particular real or imputed ethnic or religious identities. And in specific contexts, men may be at particular risk to certain forms of violence because they are men. So in Lebanon, for instance, where I've conducted extensive research, Syrian refugee men have often felt unable to leave their homes for fear that they would be detained and or deported. And this directly affects their abilities and in fact their family members' well-being and safety as well, their abilities to engage in different forms of livelihood strategies and practice keep themselves and their families safe. So amongst other things, these men's inability to safely leave the private sphere to work means that families often rely on their children begging alive. So in the context of Lebanon, and as in many other host states, certain refugee men's vulnerability is caused by a policy structure. It's not essentialist, it's not because they are men per se, but rather because of the policy framework which depicts risk of detention and deportation because they are securitized, because they are seen and reproduced as a risk. So here I'm just going to briefly wrap up, and then really looking forward to Sandra's presentation and then our conversation and your questions afterwards. Just to point to this distinction between situational and essentialist vulnerabilities. And here I'm drawing on an argument that I developed in the study that was commissioned by the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also builds on my broader research in this area over the past decade, which is that the literature notes that effective policy interventions should be based on a situational approach to vulnerability. Traditionally, there has been an essentialist approach, which is effectively focusing on a single And in contrast with this essentialist approach, a situational approach accounts for the particular factors that lead to specific people being unable or able to safely participate in particular situations. So, for example, a disabled adolescent from a minoritized ethnic group may be vulnerable to particular forms of exploitation and discrimination in a particular setting, whilst being safe and well supported at home. So it's not their identity per se that creates a vulnerability to discrimination or exclusion. It's the context and the situation, different power structures that frame their experiences in that space, in that context. And a situational approach is very well suited to recognizing the protection needs of different groups of people and the particular risks that they face in those specific contexts. It takes into account not only how gender and age, for example, might shape refugees' experiences, but also how this is informed by context and other intersecting identity markers, such as religion, ethnicity, and other forms of identity markers, as I say. So I hope I'm within my time frame there. And as I say, really looking forward to hearing Sandra's insights and her presentation, and then continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Sandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Elena, for setting out this important basis and sharing your extensive experience. You have been my hero in my academic journey so far. I'm overall quite junior comparing to you both, Jocelyne and Elena. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. I hope I will do justice to my respondents to represent their voices. Given that I'm a postdoctoral fellow, I should mention as well, I'm a humanitarian practitioner. My background is in gender in policy, in policy and planning, and I have an experience in faith-based organizations and mainstream humanitarian agencies. But I will today draw on my specific gender-based violence project that I have developed during my PhD and now postdoctoral fellowship. In advance, I'm going to put all the links that I will be referring throughout in this presentation for convenience, as I'm here alone. Just in advance, I will be referring to all these links now. So I would like to address you with some of my findings from the PhD project that examine the influences of religion in the experiences of sexual gender-based violence in forced migration experiences of women in two countries, Turkey and Tunisia. In addition, I will draw some evidence from other countries of the Solida project, where I was serving as a policy fellow in the last few years. The evidence herein will be from the UK, Australia, Turkey, and Sweden. And I would like to highlight here the lived experiences. So many things that have Elena outlined, I will hopefully present some empirical evidence to this intersectionality of different identities and how the different power dynamics shape inequalities and vulnerabilities of people that are accumulating around certain identity markers. And I will also talk about the level, the extent of faith sensitivity of humanitarian responses, whether humanitarian responses are fit enough to recognize the intersecting vulnerability factors in forced migration experiences. So to begin with, I just would like to emphasize that religion has been, unfortunately, quite an overlooked and under-terrorized category in humanitarian and forced migration research, policy, and practice. We know that the issue of religion raises lots of religion and gender equally, actually raises many contentions. And contentions, there are many question marks, and there are many angles to this inquiry of the intersection of religion and gender in forced migration experience that we could take on. My angle to this research was intersectional and socio-ecological, meaning that I'm using ecological lens, looking at how religion and gender identity-based vulnerabilities manifest at different levels in individual, family, community, and societal levels. We know that many forced migrants are and people from general populations still express religious affiliation with we have this general, quite, I don't know if it's expired statistic, but it's the number that we used to use a lot, that 8 in 10 people are still affiliating with some religious branches. And we also know that in processes of migration, gender inequalities exacerbate. Yes, there is lots of studies showing that people flee religious persecution or gender inequalities in their countries, but unfortunately, very rarely they find safety, because the level of different factors, the different power dynamics, the races, the structural inequalities, the migration-related stressors cause additional barriers for people to access safety. And unfortunately, the general statistic that we perhaps may know amongst ourselves, that 1 in 3 women globally experience some kind of violence in migration settings, can increase to 7 in 10 women. This is quite of a, I think, illustrative statistic that demonstrates us that for processes of migration can be, are generating additional vulnerabilities to violence, and gender and religious intersecting inequalities and vulnerabilities are some of the underpinning causes of this experiences of violence. So in my study, I used religion as a term. I try to use a pragmatic understanding of religion. We know that there are many different definitions of religion, and herein I defined a pragmatic understanding of religion, meaning that I try to understand what my respondents in my studies understand by religion. And in that way, I hope that the study looked at what religion is in women's experience and what it does in their daily lives, meaning shaping vulnerability, but also what I discovered, it shaped an enormous source of resilience. Women talked more often about resilience and protection that religion gave them than risks and vulnerability and causes of violence. I will unpack it in right now as I will be going through the findings of my study. So the study was conducted in 2019. It involved around 70 respondents, Muslim and Christian women in Turkey and Tunisia from around 10 nationalities, mainly Iraqi and Syrian women, and then a number of women of different African nationalities from West and Eastern Africa. And the service providers who participated in the study were mainly humanitarian actors who played different kind of protection roles in their organizations, where either they were gender focal points or gender-based violence specialists or mental health and psychosocial support specialists. And what the study points is, first of all, the continuum of violence in conflict and forced migration. With what I see, and also my colleagues from the Cesari project, we see that violence spreads across borders. It's not something that can be contained, because the level of vulnerabilities across the different intersectional levels is just enormous and is increasing. And the scale of the forced displacement responses have not yet matched the needs and the scale of needs of displaced populations. It's clear that violence, yes, moves from refuge to transit and camp settings, but also continues to different countries of transit, multiple locations, and multiple places of refuge. Violence is perpetrated by different people in authorities, such as smugglers, traffickers, militia, other migrants, partners, and spouses. And unfortunately, this violence accumulates in the continuum of violence. The longer displacement, the more incidents of abuse in summary. Within this experience, a religion comes out with two aspects. One is a religion as vulnerability, and second as resilience. And what is an overarching finding is that religion really mattered for forced displaced women, that it was a very important resource for them to either resist violence or to find emotional safety. I will elaborate that in a second. In terms of the risks, a perceived religious identity based on how people look, escalated abuse risks. For example, to discrimination and persecution because of the perceptions of who the women were, based on the perception of women's religious affiliation. So, for example, Levantine respondents, those who self-identified as Sunni, they would be vulnerable to religious persecution in conflict due to being the majority group in Syria or a minority group in Iraq. And this was judged based on their religious belonging as suggested by their religious attire. So depending what they were wearing, whether they were wearing hijab or niqab, they would be judged by different parties of the conflict who they belong to, and they would be either attacked or protected. And in terms of African respondents as minorities in Tunisia, they were pronouncing clearly that they felt that they were racially discriminated, but also Christian women felt disadvantaged because of their religion. And many women from different countries also spoke that those who were affiliated with oppressed religious identity or ethnic identity throughout their refugee journey, they felt that they were discriminated during the checkpoints, during crossings of checkpoints and internal displacement or transit. In Turkey, for example, ethnic identity also played a role in women's experiences. Arab Syrian women felt more disadvantaged than Turkoman Syrians who spoke Turkish language in informal aid distributions, and Iraqi women have felt more discriminated than Syrian women because they couldn't access nationality-based aid provided to Syrians under temporary protection. And I couldn't overlook the gender, culture, and religion nexus, which obviously might be of interest to many. We can't deny that religious understanding can be an additional factor that might be increasing some women's acceptance or tolerance of violence, but this was not a dominant factor. The different factors, such as lack of access to legal assistance and lack of access to public funds and housing and nationality-based aid system, which discriminated against people of not targeted nationalities, have been a higher factor, a more influential factor in women's experiences, if I may summarize in that way. But nonetheless, religious beliefs, such as in destiny and patience and being rewarded in the afterlife, deterred some women from seeking help and compounded their vulnerability. Some religious misbeliefs from selective readings of religious texts were misused by perpetrators, as described by some of the women who told me that their husbands who were described as non-religious, they would use some religious scriptures to justify domestic abuse. And a few women recalled that they were advised by religious leaders to remain patient and endure domestic abuse. But before I go to religion as a protective factor, which is another part of the story, I just want to finalize that in Turkey, I need to highlight this, that the sexual harassment issues and offers of transactional sex were very common. This was offered by mayors from host and refugee communities alike. And all women that I talked to actually raised this issue that they've been approached for sexual favors in exchange for shopping, aid, or any type of assistance. And here, religion was not mentioned as a factor. So sometimes religion is a contributing factor, and sometimes it might be a silent factor, depending on the context and social context and an interplay of multiple factors in socioecology of women's lives. Religion as resilience and coping resource. This is an important element I would like to bring to you because it's often overlooked by practitioners as at least in my interactions with many practitioners, but also in this academic research, I found that religion has been rarely accounted for as a resilience resource. Whilst in the absence of all different types of, in the absence and social ruptures to enforce displacement, there was nothing else that women could rely on than their religious beliefs and their faith. Women would mention that religion was the only thing that kept them going when everything else failed them and everything else just didn't work. The only thing that was left to them was their religious resources, which were their beliefs, religious practices, experiences, and at times for some religious organization. But religion in my engagement and my academics journey so far has been more often announced, was more often described by respondents as a non-institutionalized religion, personalized religion that doesn't depend on any structure, that it's something that people just carry with them through the borders, and something that they rely on drawing on the spiritual capital that they developed before displacement. Sometimes they would still like to recover some of the lost religious resources, such as access to prayer groups and access to places of worship, or observance of religious holidays, and so on. But in many circumstances, such as in sexual trafficking or detention, simply women sometimes couldn't use their religious coping at all, their prayers or reading religious scriptures, either due to lack of access and physical barriers, or fear of oppression, or lack of religious accessories. And sadly, across these countries that I researched, my research was based in, but also the other countries that I was involved in all the studies, none of the respondents said that humanitarian actors or welfare protection actors have helped them to access religious accessories that they needed to be able to adapt their religious coping mechanisms in displacement. Only one survivor of sexual trafficking, for example, accessed pastoral care remotely, and it was a life-saving guidance how to recover from sexual trauma. There are a range of different cognitive, behavioral, and spiritual, emotional, religious coping strategies that women used during this at different stages of forced migration. These were different beliefs, practices, and experiences that helped them to build resistance to their abusers, to negotiate their circumstances by reinterpreting religious texts from patriarchal lens to egalitarian lens. The prayers, religious rituals, all different types of rituals helped women to keep calm and to connect with the divine, find empowerment and patience. And there were also negative religious coping mechanisms. Unfortunately, there's another side of positive religious coping, which generated in women survivors of violence spiritual struggles, such as self-blame, feelings of guilt, or feeling that God was punishing them. Anyhow, religious coping have often coincided, went in parallel with self-reliance and a stronger self. And yet high psychological distress and religious coping went in parallel as well. This meaning that religious coping has been helping women to perhaps buffer further mental health problems, but it didn't decrease the existing psychological distress, because the level of daily stresses was so high that psychological distress just continued very high, and religious coping was also high in response to the stresses. And my favorite part of this studies, and something I'm working on now in my postdoctoral fellowship, is to develop ways of engagement to create more faith sensitivity of humanitarian responses in forced displacement. Of course, in reference to violence against women and girls. So I'm working now on developing a guidance note, for example, on how service providers could work with religion to prevent and minimize risks that are intersecting with religion and gender, or how they could use religion to build resilience and help women to heal and to recover from their traumas based on the known ways of coping, for which in this case, among religious women who identify with religious affiliations, are religious coping methods. In the study that I've done, just very briefly, I've discovered.
Please, I'm not trying to wrap up because
Okay,
yes,
so,
you are way beyond. Please, a couple of minutes, okay?
Yeah, apologies for that. So there is a religious disengagement continuum. I see that humanitarian actors either engage with religion or disengage, and it comes from along the spectrum from inactive engagement to active engagement, and they often would do so for reactive reasons. If, for example, to respond to accommodate, to contextualize the responses, to localize the responses, but often it would be for instrumental reasons. They would very rarely they would like to do it in transformative way. They will be just responding and reacting. In conclusion, the recommendations are four. First of all, we need to recognize that religion has been an important matter for forced displaced women, which should be reflected in the design of post-migration responses, responses to forced displacement in terms of policy and practice. It's important to integrate religion as intersectional and socio-ecological factor in resilience building and risk reduction. There are different practical ways how to do it. Expanding gender analysis to religious context by including religious and social and cultural factors, because religious often comes in intersection with social and cultural factors, never on its own, and also obviously intersects with politics and power and other things. And the third recommendation is to develop religiously sensitive risk mitigation strategies to draw on religious resources, and because there are resources that can help to prevent violence against women and religious discrimination, we need to work more with informal women leaders and women faith organizations to dismantle some misconceptions around violence against women and help seeking. And finally, it's important to integrate religion into mental health and psychosocial responses to help support survivors' religious coping mechanisms, for example, by facilitating access to religious resources that they need. So I will end here, and I'm happy to take questions concerning the new project on women in forced displacement in the Muslim world. This is a new project in progress, so there are no findings to present, but at least the concept I could elaborate a little bit more. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sandra. So for the sake of discussion, I would like to turn to both of you with a question which is about the situational approach that both of you actually presented. And this goes nicely with one of the questions we have from Catherine Marshall, exactly on that point. So in order to specify a little more the discussion, from the studies we have, we can see that religion and gender, when we look at refugee crisis, are shaped by three contexts. The first one is not just gender and religion as a theory. It's what is the situation of religion and gender in what's called the sending country. And some of you already mentioned that, you know, the dynamic of religion and gender in Syria is very different from the one in Turkey, and both are Muslim countries. So it's not just Islam, something is happening here. And from some of the survey, we know that in Turkey, that's kind of a paradox, but the law is more liberal, the practices are more conservative, while in, for example, there is no polygamy in Turkey, while polygamy, if I'm not mistaken, is still allowed in Syria, but the practices of Syrian women are more liberal than the one of Turkish women, especially in the areas of hosting. So right there, could you give us, both of you, some element when and how this this shaping of gender and religion from the sending country is influencing the situation of the refugee women and men. By the way, I like very much Elena, because I think that's the forefront. We are not studying enough the discrimination of young men and boys in the refugee situation. And I think it should be done in interaction with the women too. It's not just gender in different silos, you know. So so then what is the context in which these persons are resettled? Because if I look at the way that women, Islam, and men also are looked into Europe, we are facing a big issue that you mentioned, Elena, which means there is a very negative approach on the Muslim man, even if he's a Christian refugee, and how this impacts. I'm thinking of Germany and the whole anxiety around the Muslim men coming to rape our women, you know. So this also influences the role of gender right there. And the third element, which is even more complex, is that the discussion, the narrative on what role religion play in any situation, not only personally, but also socially, is very much influenced by religious narrative that you cannot pinpoint to one country, that belong to a more transnational approach. I'm thinking of neo-Salafi, I'm thinking of more liberal approach, both. And how do the people in these different contexts are latching on this narrative, or just not even referring to them? So this is to give more substance to the situational approach that I think is indeed, and we agree in the project we're doing at the Berkley Center, this is the way to look at religion. And intersecting also with ethnicity or gender. So I'm going to give the floor back to you to give us concrete example in different context of the positive and negative. The best way would be to give us both how religion help or prevent the situation of women and men in refugee situations. So Elena, and then Sandra again.
Okay, thank you, Jocelyne. Some excellent questions there, and I'll just touch on a couple. So firstly, I think that there's a potential, it's not quite a disjuncture, but the simultaneity of the advancement in humanitarian programming, for example, in recognizing that in order for her to be able to access religious belief and practice intersect in significant ways. So not all women, not all Muslims, and not all Muslim women have the same basic needs, but a veil, a hijab, may well be a basic need. But a hijab can also be a marker which leads to increased risk and vulnerability, precisely as a marker of religious visibility, as it were. So one example that we draw on in the case of the study commissioned by the Foreign Ministry of the Netherlands is taken from Samuels et al. And here it's an example of a visibly Muslim Syrian woman being targeted in Baalbek in niqab. So this woman spoke as follows. She said, "A man stopped me in the middle of the street and asked me to remove the veil from my face and told me, 'Next time I don't want to see you wearing it.' I was alone in the street," she says, "and when you walk on the street there, you feel lonely, so I had to remove it. I was scared. Next time he might shoot me or my son or scare me or kidnap me. Once they followed my sister-in-law and they were calling her Daesh, Daesh, and she had to remove the veil." So here the veil is both an intrinsic marker of dignity and something that needs to be provided by humanitarian actors to ensure that women who wish to veil can do so and access the public sphere in dignity. And yet the veil is also a marker which can lead to increased vulnerability. So it can be the same woman with the same needs, but the context and the situation means that that her vulnerabilities to different forms of risk and different forms of violence play out in different ways. ways. So that's one example in which a neighboring country, which is not Muslim majority, as we know in the case of Lebanon, with a very delicate sectarian balance implemented within and institutionalized within the political system. But we see that Syrian women who are visibly Muslim are read politically, and that the religious markers increase their vulnerability. And then this then ties us back to precisely why intersectionality is such an important approach to this, which is not simply focusing on identity markers or on markers of visible identity, but rather focusing in on the structural barriers and the structural inequalities that create these vulnerabilities to begin with. So which political structures, which institutional structures, which humanitarian programs themselves are actually creating systems of inequality, systems of oppression and of exploitation. And it's really, I think, pivotal that we focus in on those structural barriers. So people's resilience is essential, but when the systems continue to oppress and the systems continue to create risk and create violence, then we need to really tackle the structures rather than putting the response or keeping the responsibility on individuals. It's systemic. It's structural, and that I think is where we need to direct our attention. So very, very briefly, and over to Sandra, who I'm sure has very important examples to share with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Elena. Very important points mentioned. Yes, that's a very important question. Situational approach. Certainly, religion is dynamic and is changing across settings. Sometimes women describe situations where their beliefs just traveled and they were unchanged, and sometimes they would describe new opportunities for education, for self-reflection and spiritual discovery that led them to increase knowledge of religious rights, religious women's rights. To give you some specific examples of good and bad things, obviously religion is a blessing. And here I will recall a story of a survivor of domestic violence. She was subjected to prolonged, protracted domestic violence in Syria, not only by her husband, but also by mother-in-law, which is very popular in this setting. And upon arrival to Ankara in Turkey, from Syria, she has described a positive shift of behavior of her husband. She would say that her husband now goes to Turkey, to Turkish mosques, and in these mosques there is some education about treatment of women or something, and she would say that he is less violent. He's more friendly towards them. So this is one positive example, but unfortunately there are also bad examples where a woman would say that because of the shifting circumstances and lack of social protection and breaking of family dynamics, husbands would become even more abusive because they knew that their wives have nowhere to run away. They cannot go back to their countries of armed conflicts because they would be at different risks. And they knew that they are alone there are no families to protect, so they would be exercising even more aggression. They would be even more violent towards the women, and they would often, unfortunately, in some instances, they would use religious arguments which traveled with them from their socialization, early stages of education, I believe, from Syria, where they would just remember some verses of the Quran, for example. They would say this verses, this and that, but there is nothing else that they would practice in their region. They wouldn't even, they were not practicing as the woman they described. And other factors such as lack of employment and races that men encountered in countries of refuge have escalated their aggression towards their families. So obviously the frustration and anger is something that forced migration processes can exacerbate. There are other examples of men in Sweden, for example. Some of the study, I remember this quote from Iman, who said that, first of all, whenever his wife was saying that when I only arrived to Sweden and had contact with social workers, they would tell me to take off my hijab. They would assume that I don't want to wear it. That was obviously on very strong Islamophobic grounds. And a man would say that he felt that they're looking at him as he was very abusive and misogynist. So there was this assumption that he is violent, which was obviously unfair towards him. And it could be considered as kind of a form of gender-based violence, the perceived violence in Muslim men. And when it comes to association of women's religious attire with armed groups such as Daesh. Yes, I would just like to recall one example of men who are crossing borders across different European countries, and they would feel that they were very much mistreated by the border controls because they were perceived that they are coming from Daesh, and they were very educated men who had nothing to do with armed groups. And okay, if it comes to situational approach, it's very important to try to understand how the religiously inspired attitudes and behaviors transform across the process of migration, different stages, and what factors can transform these attitudes. Maybe there are certain programs and certain strategies that could be deployed in countries of refuge if we look at the European context that could try to transform religious beliefs that pose risks and build in a way that build on those religious beliefs that can be protective and can be a counteract to those violent beliefs, right? There are plenty of different examples. I can see forced migration as an opportunity for transformation, not only of gender roles and relations, but also for religious empowerment and spiritual growth that is aligned with women's interests and aspirations. So maybe we'll end here. There might be another question.
Yeah. Thank you. It's interesting because I'm gonna push back on that, not on what you said, which were example indeed of situational perspective, but none of you looked from your response. My question was also on the transnational influence. You mentioned religion, different stages, but you mentioned people referring to the Quran, meaning do they read it directly? In the interviews you conducted, are there any references or interpretation that you could associate with movements or groups outside the condition of settlement or displacement, because that's also an important element that not only shape what the experience of people, but unfortunately, as you mentioned, the assumption of some of these doctrines being more influential than others. So if you have anything from your interview, and if you don't have any, it's also a finding in itself, about how do people navigate? You say it's a source, it's positive. How do they articulate this kind of reference? Elena, please.
Thank you. So I have a couple of examples of transnational elements in this regard, but also in others. So, for example, in the context of the Sahrawi refugee camps, where I conducted research in southwest Algeria, American evangelical groups were visiting the camps. And what I wrote about in my 2011 article in the special issue on faith-based humanitarian responses was how members and residents of the refugee camp themselves interact with the evangelicals and push back against the assumption that they are sponges who are going to be converted, and how they engage with evangelical visitors in order to secure the humanitarian and political assistance that they need to remain on the board. So people engage critically, strategically with different religious and ideological perspectives. And when I was there was a rock concert which had been organized by the American Evangelical Group, bringing significant amounts of humanitarian aid as well as political kudos through their campaigning, and a group of Spanish solidarity actors were horrified that these evangelicals were trying to convert a Muslim refugee community in the middle of the desert, which they felt was a situation of intrinsic vulnerability. And the Spanish civil society actors were very angry that they were there. And the Sahrawi people who were attending the concert were saying, we'll happily take their packets of rice with pictures of Jesus and with scripture on the side, because this doesn't change who we are or what. They were able to navigate that situation in a more direct manner, in fact, than the Spanish. And they really were worried that they were going to be forcibly converted and vulnerable by virtue of who they were. Now, in my in another project that I'm leading, which is called Southern Responses to Displacement, one of the elements that we're looking at is how actors from across the so-called global South provide responses to people from Syria and Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. And one element that we are looking at is also faith-based transnational forms of support, whether officially identified as faith-based or whether through state-based assistance programs which have religious and ideological discourses and elements underpinning them. And again, we find different forms of responses from people who are receiving assistance, and the jokes that arise when everybody's wearing a Saudi logo on the back of their jacket or on their rucksacks, and how people barter not only material goods but also jokes and little quips about, you know, is this any better or worse than the UNHCR logo? Because logos are logos, and what people really want is to receive assistance that doesn't identify them as recipients. Really, they want to receive aid, and this is where citing the Quran, etc., does arise, which is saying, you know, that giving should be given for God's sake, not giving for the logos and the publicity that arises in these situations. And I'll post a piece on this notion of the ethics of undisclosed care. So of course there are many different transnational actors, whether they're Christian evangelical or Gulf organizations, looking at Malaysian and Indonesian support for Palestinians in the Middle East as well, and the religious elements that are embedded within those processes. So I'm sure that Sandra also has other examples. I'll post a couple of links now in the chat.
Thank you. Sandra?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a complex question. So in terms of transnational religious influences, first of all, I wanted to highlight that at least women that I've spoken with, and I need to highlight that this is a small-scale study, they did express their agency, and they would say that they avoided institutionalized religion. They would say they wouldn't rely on any mosque, they wouldn't rely on religious leaders because they feared them. That was just an example from Turkey. And many of them said that, yeah, but these were women who spoke Arabic, and some of them could read the Quran or themselves. Many were illiterate, but they relied on their own understanding, and some interactions with women's groups, they would try to avoid others, men, religious men from this institutionalized institutions in general. But this was different in Africa, in Tunisia, where I met a number of African women who have been mainly Christian, and they really longed to connect with their churches that they left behind, and they represented 10 different churches, such a diverse group of women they were. And they unfortunately didn't have access to this places of worship, and I was surprised that there was very little action done by Christian churches of different denominations to support those women in these displaced situations that were very, very dire. They really they were in unspeakable hardship, as I may literally, I can't describe it. And they longed to read the Bible. They really thought that their lives would be transformed if they had the chance to read some passages of the Bible to reconnect with God in that way. There was one church 100 kilometers away that was inaccessible for most of them. But luckily, okay, one pastor was coming there quarterly, but it was just one pastor coming for 2,000 migrants who wanted to talk to him. Obviously, it was insufficient. So there, I see this as a gap where transnational networks didn't manage to appear, I don't know, to provide sufficient aid to these populations. In the UK, there are some interesting examples here. So often, while women not often, but some women do discover religious support in different denominations and even in different faiths. So one woman described how she was a Muslim woman, and she found more support in a church than a mosque in the UK. And eventually she would convert to be a Jehovah's Witness, because she was approached by Jehovah's Witnesses, and she really found love from this group of believers, and she became one of them. So that's a transformation that he went through. In Poland, I can just recall when the Ukrainian crisis escalated last year. I remember many faith groups were trying to ask me, because I'm originally from Poland, they tried to ask me where we could provide support, which groups are in need. And I remember at that time there were many mainstream Muslim NGOs who were trying to reach faith groups inside Ukraine. Well, I couldn't help much. I only knew one women's group that I connected, and I was pleased to see that they managed to fund them and provide support through the mosques in Ukraine. And this was I wouldn't call them as a transnational religious influence, because these organizations don't identify as such. They identify themselves as mainstream humanitarian respondents. So perhaps issues of identity and perception of faith-based organizations as another important consideration we should take account of. Well, this is what I have. I don't have other evidence that I could recall here, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Thank you. Another round of questions from me is this time moving the spot from the people to the institution in charge of the policy about refugees, and how is religion addressed? And Sandra, I completely agree with your point. From my own research, there is a rejection of all forms of institutionalized religion and of all forms of authority that talk in the name of people who do not think that these voices represent them. So one question we are always having in the discussion on policy making: first, do the secular organization turn to any religious resources? And if they do, how do they do it? Meaning, do they refer to the imam in the mosque, outside the camp, or in the camp? Do they refer to the people who are part of this settlement? How does this work? Because I have seen both with very conflicting results. So again, from your perspective of research and what you have witnessed on the ground, what is the positioning of secular organization, which at the end of the day are still the one driving the policies, and how do they work or do not work with religion, and which aspect of religion do they refer to? Again, Elena and then Sandra.
Thank you.
Meantime, dear audience, if you have any question, it's still the time to write up a few while our two panelists take the floor. Please, Elena.
Thank you. So certainly UNHCR, in part since the 2011 special issue of the Journal of Refugee Studies, because that was cited by the High Commissioner as one of the foundations for this move towards the Welcoming the Stranger initiative in 2013. So UNHCR has been increasingly recognizing and supporting the roles played by faith leaders in supporting the rights of refugees. Very much a strategic operationalization of particular groups of people, both for fundraising capabilities to attempt to reach so-called hard-to-reach populations, fitting into the broader localization of aid agenda, which has been advocated since the World Humanitarian Summit in 2000 and kind of 2010 onwards, that shift towards localization and institutionalization of faith, but only particular representatives, only particular people who are either visible or legible as potential interlocutors. So there is simultaneously an inclusion or an attempt to include a greater number of actors, but still a barrier, which includes that barrier around assumptions pertaining to gender. So this assumption that, okay, well, we can allow the imams to do this, but surely they're still patriarchal and how patriarchy only them and kind of Western institutional and political structures that exist, etc. So there's simultaneously this continuation of the assumption that faith equals patriarchal versus secular equals gender equal and gender empowered, which is, as we know, not the case, because there's as much discrimination within so-called secular organizations and within so-called secular countries as that there is elsewhere. It just articulates itself in different ways. But there's also still, as I say, this prioritization of particular religious groups and the continuation of the securitization and the criminalization of other religious groups. So there is partial inclusion, it's strategic, it's operationalizing the zakat drives within UNHCR. There are more actors and there's more funding available through including faith actors, but it's still on UNHCR's terms. It's still on the framework of humanitarian response and what is considered to be acceptable principles of humanitarian response. Again, I've written quite a bit about this, so I can add in some references since we don't have as much time as we might like to be able to discuss in more detail. So I'll pop those into the chat box now and turn over to Sandra.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you, Elena. I would echo many things that Elena has just said, and just adding to that, what I see is that many secular organizations are resistant to engage with some of the faith-based organizations due to concerns whether they will be able to comply to humanitarian standards. So the issues of neutrality and impartiality are perhaps some of the key concerns, and even sometimes in different platforms, on one hand, we see secular humanitarian actors who are willing to collaborate with faith-based institutions and faith-based mechanisms of financing responses to forced displacement. And on the other hand, there are those who are resisting it. And I see the trend that those big organizations that I think we can say in general, UN agencies have capacity to navigate, and they are quite diplomatic in engaging with faith-based actors. More and more agencies are developing their own strategies and guidance notes for engagement. But I see that those local organizations on the ground who are funded by institutional donors are very much careful to be in any way associated with any faith group due to concerns that they will breach international humanitarian standards and the funding will be seized and cost in times. War on terror has obviously created many additional financial barriers for many faith-based institutions to operate. So faith-based organizations are constrained in many countries, in large operations are constrained to perhaps exercise their ability to provide more aid. Sometimes there are some agencies that are faith-based who have been experiencing difficulties to transfer funds for humanitarian actions due to increased diligence. Likewise, and very ironically, we can see that many Western secular humanitarian agencies are now turning to, for example, to zakat as institution, not only UNHCR, but also other mainstream INGOs that are using zakat for fundraising purposes. This is one of the aspects of the project that I'm leading on now, that will be investigating how can we use, how can we leverage Islamic financing to counter gender-based violence in displacement, for example, because there are, I believe, and there's a huge tradition of, women's protection and honoring women in different faith traditions. And if there are faith-based financing associated with certain religions, I think this funding must be used to also meet and match the promise of religion, liberation and equality and protection of women. I can also just recall that I think Emma Tomalin was writing in some paper about the brokering function of larger institutions. So large secular organizations like to partner with large faith-based organizations in order to reach out to local faith-based groups and faith leaders. This is being done perhaps in a way to be protected and to do it in a professional and humanitarian, quality reassured way. So, one interesting question. Thanks for that. And before I end, I can just highlight that there is still this faith. I call it a secular and faith disconnect. And I hope that in future I'll be able to investigate it further. How can we connect closer secular and faith-based institutions to work together on humanitarian causes? Thank you.
Thank you. So I think you already anticipated, Sandra, what I wanted to ask to close up. On a positive note, actually, an example of best practice. It seems to me that this interest for zakat in fundraising could fit into best practice in the use of religion for policy making. You may add something else if you want, but Elena, is there anything that really strikes you as efficient in the way that refugee policies have been able to include the religious dimension? It may not be. You can both.
Thank you, Jocelyne. So I think what my research has really been focusing in on is the ways that people who have displacement backgrounds themselves respond to their own needs and their own rights and the rights of those people who they live alongside and with. So my research has been looking at refugee-led responses to displacement, and that includes responses which are intrinsically interconnected with faith in implicit or in explicit manners. So I've written about this a fair amount again in refugee hosts and also in southern responses to displacement, but it's really recognizing that people are already and always responding to their own situations and the situations of others. And then it's a matter of identifying what are the structural barriers that make those possibilities harder. What is it that makes the ability of communities and of individuals difficult to navigate? So how can those structural barriers be overcome? But we have many examples, whether it's neighbours, local communities, the invisible faith leaders, as Sandra and you have both indicated, who are collecting and distributing resources, who are accompanying people in burials to ensure that loved ones are buried in dignity, to ensure that people are able to navigate situations in which vulnerabilities are enhanced and increased, and ensuring that all people are able to access the resources and the support that they require and that they define themselves. So I think that there are very many local good case examples. We've documented quite a few of them as well up in the chat again, and hopefully there'll be the opportunity to continue exploring some of these best case examples. The Refugee Host Project partnered with the Joint Learning Initiative on Local Communities and Refugees Hub with a project with the UNHCR looking at good case or best case examples of local community responses. So I'll provide a link to that as well. We contributed those to the Global Compact discussions several years ago. Research in Germany, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and in Mexico and Honduras, I think, as well. So I'll post links to those if you're interested in looking at. I would be worried about using the term best case or best practice, but good practice at least. So yeah. I'll add some links there. Thank you.
Agreed. Sandra, one final word before we closed up. Any other thought you would have on this? Indeed, good practices rather than best. I agree.
Yeah, there are promising practices such as there are methodologies to transform, for example, attitudes and to gender-based violence against women that are being developed by faith-based organizations and now are being used by different stakeholders, including secular. So there are, I won't be doing any advertisements, so I won't be using names of organizations, but there's maybe I should I don't know, but there are, for example, a transforming masculinity approach championed by one Christian faith-based organization. There are other channels of hope methodology that is being used in different settings by another Christian major faith-based organization. And other organizations develop their own strategies. Perhaps many of you will know, or maybe no, sorry, can't assume who is with us today. But SASA approach is also using a faith angle to it. Has been originated from Uganda and is being now used in many publications as a good practice by many secular organizations, and it's being upscaled by different stakeholders. So yes, there are also, well, I hope there will be more practices where faith actors can be connected with displaced populations to offer psychosocial support. I think this is, I can't recall a positive example. Actually, there are. Yeah, I think this is something that we should promote to enable forced migrants to access spiritual leaders and pastoral care to enable the processes of healing if they are religious based. And there are a range of stakeholders who are using it in informal, rather informal way, because there are official referral pathways don't include faith leaders often, unfortunately, but informally, I think this is happening, and we should institutionalize such pathways. And there are examples of faith groups accompanying migrants and making them feel humane. I think there's a movement called the Word of Neighbors, for example, that does this. And there are organizations that are working on interfaith dialogues in displacement settings to help facilitate social cohesion, but also countering gender-based violence. Yeah, I think we should be more creative and innovative in integrating secular and faith approaches in settings where this matters, because in some settings it won't matter, but in many it does, and it's important to recognize such needs and allow people to choose for themselves which approaches resonate with their worldview and their needs. Thank you, Jocelyne and Elena.
Thank you both. I think we have come to the closing of this discussion. Thank you for your input, and also Elena for the wealth of references and documentation you put in the chat. We may share this probably with the whole audience in another format for the people who could not get all of it, and to be continued. And I think we are just at the beginning of all these questions and agenda. Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Sandra. And thank you all for being with us today. Bye-bye now.